See, every field has witnessed a veritable explosion of theories. Some of them, of course, have undergone a radical change, and some of them have undergone an expansion. So it's a challenge to choose an appropriate theory that fits into the ambit of your research, that fits the research objectives. Every text, especially literary text, is open to multifarious interpretations, and it can be approached in various dimensions. But what is important in a literary text is to approach a text through the lens of one particular approach, and that is what research is all about. And this is where the role of theory comes into play. As I said before, your chosen theory should be in alignment with not only the research objectives but also the research question. So for instance, let's say a researcher is choosing the theory of psychoanalysis for her research, the Sigmund Freud psychoanalysis. Let me take you through a process of how it can be applied. So I'm going to demonstrate that using a framework. It's not necessarily the theory of psychoanalysis. Any theory can be applied based on the framework that I'm going to demonstrate now. See, before the definition, let me give you a cameo shot of all the important components in a theoretical background. The first thing is you need to write a preamble for your theory. For example, your theory is a psychoanalytic theory. You need to write a preamble stating about the importance of that particular theory in the present context. So the first thing is after you have to write a preamble. So after that you move on to discuss its basic premises. What are the fundamental tenets of the theory? What are its key principles that drive the theory? So you have to just write a note on the key principles and then move on to write the key terms, the key variables in your study. For instance, psychoanalytic theory is so comprehensive that it has, lot of variables. You have the principles such as the ego and the superego. It can further be classified into denial, repression, pleasure principle, Oedipus complex, Electra complex. It has a lot of terminologies. So what you need to do is you have to choose the variables that falls in the ambit of your study. So for instance, if you are going to deal only with repression and sublimation in your work, you can take only those two terms. It is not necessary for you to entirely review the different principles of the theory. So you can choose the variables that you are working on, and accordingly you can glean those aspects on the theory. As I said, if you are going to deal only with repression and sublimation, you can take those principles and clearly explain those principles, and after that you have to state how your research study is going to elucidate on those principles. For example, if it is a literary research, then you will talk about how the characters exhibit those traits that you are talking about. How does your character exhibit repression? How does your character represent sublimation? So you'll be discussing about those concepts. So you have to, after that you have to give a critical evaluation of the primary sources. So you'll just go back to psychoanalytic theory and you will review, and even the secondary sources, what others have said about the psychoanalytic theory. So you'll do an entire review of the theory with reference to your variables, and then you move on to discuss about its practical application. What is the kind of relevance that it has on your study, and ultimately you will wrap up by talking about the limitations of your theory. So what kind of limitations does it have? So these are some of the components. Now let me move on to the demonstration and show you how it can be applied in a research context. See, let us assume that the tentative title is A Psychoanalytic Perspective of the Select Novels of Bharati Mukherjee. Let's see how a scholar can apply the theory of psychoanalytic theory in this context. First of all, you have to write the preamble of the study. As I said, a preamble is an introduction statement that actually sets the context. It provides the much needed traction. See, for instance, of all the critical theories, psychoanalytic theory is the most abused and least appreciated. Yet, if it is properly applied for critical analysis, it could be fascinating and rewarding. So it creates an interest in the readers about the theory. So just give a preamble to start with. And secondly, clearly define the theory. The theory has to be defined in layman terms. You shouldn't go for any too technical definition. See, clearly define. See, in this context, let's see how the theory is defined. The psychoanalysis is defined as a set of therapeutic methods which have their origin in the work and theories of Sigmund Freud. The primary assumption of psychoanalysis is the belief that all people possess unconscious thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories. So just clearly define the theory. Anything that is not clearly defined, any field that is not clearly defined is a field that is not fully evolved. So better give a clear, a layman definition for the term. Thirdly, move on to discuss the basic premises of the theory, the fundamental tenets, the key principles of the theory. Take a look at the application here. The basic premise behind psychoanalytic theory is that inner drives, unconscious motives, and unresolved needs from childhood govern our development. So this is the fundamental premise of this principle. So you just discuss the fundamental premise of the principle. Then move on to discuss about the proponents of the theory, about the pioneers. And you can also discuss about who pioneered it and what are its offshoots. So that will provide a context to the readers. See here, the idea of psychoanalysis first began to receive serious attention under Sigmund Freud, who formulated his own theory of psychoanalysis in the 1980s. So you just give a background of who the proponent is or who pioneered the theory. And then you just go on. It's a very important step. You just write a rationale for the theory, which means why you have chosen that particular theory for your study and how can that theory give the reader more insights. How will it help you to critically evaluate the text better? So give a kind of a justification. So write a clear rationale as to why you have chosen that particular theory for your research study. So how does the theory help you to analyze the work better? So that is the rationale. So after the rationale, go on to discuss the key terms in the theory. See, the key terms that you discuss should be in alignment with your research objectives or research questions. As I discussed earlier, you need not discuss about all the concepts of a particular theory. Whatever tenets that you are evaluating, you discuss only that. For example, the psychoanalysis may discuss various terminologies like the id, the ego, and the superego, and has more subclassifications such as denial, repression, pleasure, resistance, sublimation, these kind of terminologies that may fall into any one of these ambits, either in the ambit of ego or the id or the superego. So you need not evaluate all the variables in your study, which is absolutely impossible. So you take only the tenets that you are going to associate your work with. So for instance, let's say you are going to study your characters in the light of repression and sublimation. Only take those key terms and define what those terms are and say that these are the terms, these are the variables that I am going to test in the context of the study. So take a look at it. Explain the key terms of your research variables, how the researcher explains the key terms here. Repression in psychoanalytic theory is the exclusion of distressing memories
thoughts or feelings of unconscious mind. So repression is defined. Then go on to define sublimation. In psychology, sublimation is a mature type of defense mechanism in which socially unacceptable impulses or idealizations are transformed into socially acceptable actions or behavior. So you clearly define what are your variables. And then this is a very important steps in your theoretical application. You will describe how your characters exhibit these variables. As I said, repression and sublimation, how does your characters exhibit these two variables? You will discuss in detail. For example, how are you going to study these two concepts in uh, the context of your research? For example, look at the example. The psyche of Bharati Mukherjee is well understood through her characters. The women characters are representatives of her own experiences, often involving painful childhood memories. Through them, she extricates the trials and tribulations. The portrayal of characters is the evidence of the gradual change in the writer's psyche. So here you have given some justification for repression. So this is a sample. Actually, I haven't read Bharati Mukherjee. I am quite generic here for the sake of driving home the point. I'm just only showing you how a theory can be actually applied. So our second variable was to test the sublimation. So I've just given. For example, in the novel The Desirable Daughters, the protagonist exhibits sublimation, a mature type of defense mechanism. So you show through the various gleanings of your work how you can justify the aspect of sublimation and repression. So you define or discuss both. So moving on, you will be now discussing about the critical evaluation of the sources, the primary and secondary sources, what other authors have said about the variables such as sublimation and regression. So critically evaluate what others have said. Do not describe. After doing that, you move to a very important segment called the practical application. Take a look at how it is practically applied here. The practical application of psychoanalytic theory. See, according to Maven et al., psychoanalysis helps people understand themselves by exploring the impulses they often do not recognize because they are hidden in the unconscious. So find a support with some reference. You support your statements. Say how it can be practically applicable in the present context. How it is applicable with respect to your study, with respect to the analysis of Bharati Mukherjee's novels. So you elucidate that. So you clearly state that it helps the researcher to recognize what is hidden in the unconscious state of the characters of. So you just state what the characters are. So that's how you have to practically apply. And eventually you need to talk about the criticisms or the limitations of the theory. So you need to talk about, because theory is actually the starting point of any critical analysis, and it makes your study more valid if you base it on certain constructs. So you have to be very clear in describing about the limitations of your study. So you need to clearly explain how does modern thoughts debunk the old ideologies. Do you agree with how the earlier authors have deconstructed the opinions of psychoanalytic theory, or how do you demystify it? So talk about the limitations. For example, look at the limitation here. One of the largest criticisms of psychoanalytic theory is that it places too much of emphasis on childhood. For one, Freud's theory says that personality development occurs during childhood, but many modern psychologists say that this development is lifelong. So this aspect of Freud is debunked by the previous reviewers, previous researchers. So how they have debunked it? So based on their stance, you show the limitations of the study. So especially for a literature review, this is a rough framework of how you apply a theory. Perhaps in a quantitative or empirical study, the application of theory is different. Maybe I'll do a separate video on how a theory has to be applied in an empirical study. I hope that you found this video useful, and I hope that it will help you to apply your theory for your research study. Thank you for viewing.